Hello, and welcome to part 2 of The Cutting Room, where I teach you a sewing skill. Today, I will be hemming a pair of trousers. The technique I'll be using for this is a type of blind hem. It's done by hand, so you won't need a machine for this, and this is a great candidate for things that you want to look really smooth and streamlined. So this is great for trousers, skirts, dresses, and kind of more formally wear, because the stitching doesn't really show on the outside of the garment. All right, let's get started. First, the tools you're going to need to complete this are a measuring tape, safety pins, chalk or other fabric marking tool, thread, this should match the fabric as closely as possible, hand sewing needles, a ruler, scissors, and an iron. The next step of the process is to try your trousers on. If you saw my last video with the jeans hem, then this will be the same steps. But if you haven't watched that, no worries, I'm going over them again. If you're going for a full-length pant, I suggest to try them on with the shoes that you're going to be wearing most with them. This will give you the best visualization of how the finished pant is gonna lay, because you'll be able to actually see how it fits over the shoe, where it spills over, whether there's a break or not, and all of that in context. So it's a lot easier to be able to know for sure that that's the length that you're going for when you try it on with shoes. If you're going for a crop that is above the ankle, it's not as big of a deal to try it on with shoes, but I do find that trying it on with shoes is just the most helpful and easiest way to be able to visualize the length and know for sure that that's the length that you want. Once you've folded it up to where you like it, then you can secure it in place with safety pins. I like to secure it on the inseam and the outseam, and then the front and the back. This way I know that it's not going to move if I don't have time to measure and hem in all in the same day, and it'll stay in place. I have these folded up the same way as I did my jeans. So I've got them folded in half with the fronts facing out. I've got the crotch area popped out. I've got the legs kind of smoothed out on top of each other. Just like the last time, I'm going to measure the length on the inseam so that I know what my finished length is gonna be. And also, just like last time, I will mark with chalk my finished length and the length of my hem where I want it to finish. So on my trousers, my length looks like it's about 26 3/4. I tend to round to the nearest quarter just so that it's easier, but you can be as exacting as you would like to be. And then it looks like the hem is about 1.5 inches, which for trousers you like to have a taller hem because it feels more expensive. On these ones, they're just finished with an overlock on the outside and then the blind stitch, which isn't bad, but is also not that nice. Like, I like having a finished edge and not having the overlock showing. So I would add at least 1/2 inch to fold under, because that's just easier to be able to iron down. But you could do as little as 1/4 if you wanted to. You could also do more than that if you wanted to do like a full inch or a full 1.5 inches, just like the same as the height. You could do that. It does add a little bit of bulk on a higher hem, so usually you don't add that much extra under there, but again, up to you, especially if you want to be able to have the possibility of letting out the length a little bit. You can hide some of that length in the hem. All right, I already took out the pins on my trousers, but I had measured them. And one thing that I forgot to keep in mind and notice was how much of a taper there is. So that means like where the width goes from wider up at the top to narrower down at the bottom. So originally I wanted to keep all of the original length on these, and I would have just like a much chunkier hem at the bottom. However, because they're a little bit tapered down at the end, if I were to do that, folding this up, we would have a little too much of a difference between how much circumference we have down at the bottom to where it would be meeting up here, and it would create gathering that I don't want. So I am gonna have to chop into these. So just like on the jeans, I'm gonna measure down to my finished measurement. I'm gonna add the 1.5 inches for the width, the height of my hem, and then I'm going to add 3/4, hopefully will be enough of some extra length to be able to be let out, but can't give it too much, otherwise the circumference is gonna be a little funky and I don't want any gathering down at the bottom because it'll look funny. So before I trim my length, I'm just letting out the previous hem so that it'll all lay flat when I cut. All right, so let out the hem. We've got the finished length mark, 1.5 inch hem, and then just a 1/2 inch extension, because doing any more than that, there'll be too much of a taper and I don't want to be stretching and causing any ripples to my hem. So just like the last time, I'm gonna cut on the top leg and then use that as a guide for cutting the bottom. Gonna fold down first however high that first edge of hem, or like the whatever is gonna enclose that raw edge on the inside. Fold and press that part down first. So for me, did a 1/2 inch. This is on a synthetic material, so it's a lower temperature, so sometimes I have to hold it down for a little longer to get a clean press, because I don't want the iron to be too hot. And then you fold it up the rest of the hem height, which is 1.5 inches for me. Never be afraid to crack out your ruler or your measuring tape to make sure that you're eyeballing correct, especially if your chalk line might have disappeared at some point. And then for these, since I will be hand hemming, or hand sewing I should say, I am pinning with safety pins, because then I can leave them in while I hand sew. You're gonna want easier to remove pins if you are sewing with a machine, and then safety pins are really nice when you're hand sewing because then they don't poke you. If your pins are metal, you can press over them. Just be careful, because you could leave some indentations, but at least they won't mark your fabric or melt into them like any sort of plastic would. Don't be too afraid if your creases aren't super crisp at this point, because you can always, or you should, press again after you're finished sewing, because you won't have any pins or anything in your way. When I pin this type of hem, especially on like a kind of slippy material like this, I like to pin my anchor points first, so make sure my seams are aligned. Then I'll pin in the middle, and then if I feel like I need some extra help between that middle point, then I'll add more, and then I'll do the same on the other side. Once you're done with one leg, do the same on the other. Also wanted to note where I pinned for these, because I only have a 1/2 inch rolled under here, I want to pin within that 1/2 inch so that it doesn't roll out and I'm not having to tuck it back under while I'm sewing. And then I also pinned going parallel to the hem so that it's holding down like length, so it helps me out. Because if you were to pin vertically, it wouldn't hold as much in place. Just a little tip, so there's that. Do it on the other one. All right, now that you have them pinned and pressed, you're ready to start sewing. All right, so now we're gonna get started on doing the blind hem on the trousers. So you'll need your hand sewing needle, thread that matches your pant, because even though this is an invisible stitch, there might still be a possibility of the thread showing up on the other side. So for it to be as invisible as possible, you're gonna wanna make sure that your thread matches as closely as possible. It's not gonna be a ton, so it doesn't have to be like the most perfect match, but as long as it's not like a completely different color or like a completely lighter color that's gonna be really noticeable, it should be fine. Hand sewing needle, I have thread snips, but you could also just use a pair of scissors, whatever is gonna cut the thread. And then this is not a necessary thing, but it is a nice thing if you have thread wax, especially if you, like me, prefer to double your thread when you hand sew. So when I thread my needle, I like to knot the ends together so it's a closed loop and it's a doubled up thread, both for the strength and then also because I just hate having to rethread my needle every other stitch when it falls out. So even though this can have a tendency to get a little tangled, which is what the wax helps with, I just prefer this method. It's always a lot easier to thread your needle when you pinch it really close to the end of the cut end and then thread it through. When you pinch it really close, it keeps that end a lot more stiff, so it's a little bit easier to get through. Little tip for tying a knot at the end of your thread. Loop it around your finger. You're kind of pinching the ends with your other two fingers, and then roll between your fingers, pinch, pull. And then you've got, I don't know if it's actually focusing, but you got a little knot at the end. And then if you have wax, again, not a deal breaker if you don't have any, but you can run it through the wax. You just like lay it down, pinch on top, and run it through. It kind of just tames any possible little fuzzies on the thread itself that might catch and cause tangles as you sew. I like to start at the inseam because any mistakes can be hidden. You don't have to take out your pins. This one's a little close. I'm just taking it out so it's not in my way. But what you're gonna do is start under. So I like to kind of open it up a little bit and bring my needle point up through the fold at the top so that my knot will be tucked under behind. So you're up through the fold and then you're just going to take a little bit of your like pant side and then you're going to come back through and up back through the fold. So just kind of barely grabs the other side and then come back through. If you ever get a little loop when you're doing double, you can just gently pull one side of the string or the thread or the other until it evens out. And again, kind of right beside, just grab a couple of threads of the material and then up back through. I kind of go intervals of like 1/4 inch, maybe. The closer together, the more secure it will be, because you're grabbing so little of the garment fabric. If you have the stitches be too far away from each other, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. So the distance between stitches, I like to do about 1/4 inch, but kind of up to you. The closer together, it's going to be more secure, but will take a little longer. I would suggest to not go more than like 1/2 inch in length, otherwise you run the risk of there being too many gaps in between, and then it's not gonna hold very well. But it should look like this. You have just these little like kind of ladders like going across from the inside, but from the outside you should just have kind of like almost nothing. You might see like this one, I grabbed a little bit more of the thread so you can see like a tiny little dot of the thread. Otherwise it should kind of just look like dimples almost on the outside. And like from far away, you won't be able to really see anything because you're grabbing so little of the face of the fabric, just threads. And then go back under the hem and come back up, and you're just gonna do this all the way around. Also, another tip is to not cut your thread too long. I would suggest to not have your thread be too much over like 18 inches like that you're working with, just because the more thread that you're like having to pull through, the more likely it's gonna get tangled at some point, and then you have to deal with like having to tie it off and cut a new one because it'll take too long to try to untangle. So it's just more manageable when it's shorter. You may not be able to go all the way around with one. You might have to do 2 or 3, but it'll be less of a headache if you're not constantly running into tangled thread. Take your time, don't pull too tight because this isn't like a locked stitch. So if you pull really hard, you will gather your stitches. So you just want to pull enough that it's closed, but you don't want to pull so much that it starts to scrunch. So once your thread has reached like 5-6 inches, this is where I usually tie off to then rethread a fresh needle. You could probably go a few more inches, but I wouldn't go shorter than like 4-ish inches, only because it makes it so much harder to tie off. And even though it feels like a little bit of a waste of thread, it'll make your life so much easier to not have to fight trying to tie off a really short amount of thread. So once you reach where you're comfortable with tying off, you will make a little knot. I usually kind of go across like I would be continuing on. So just taking a little bit of the main fabric and then through to the hem and kind of going up and over. And I'll do that once and pull through just like a loop. Then I'll do it again, but then before I fully close that loop, I will thread the needle through that loop, go around once more. And then instead of snipping right there, then I will go kind of through the hem a little ways away, pop it up through, and then snip there, because then it hides the tails within the hem. And then you just have a tiny little knot right there. But then I'll thread a fresh needle and then continue on. Once you've finished going all the way around and tying off at the end, it'll look something like this on the inside and nice and clean. On the outside, I have a little bit of the kind of like shadow from where it's attached. And so now you'll want to do a final press to press everything nice and flat so that the hem isn't kind of like bubbled like this. So you want to do one last nice press all the way around on both of the patent legs. I also like to do a final press with it right side out. Your finished result should look something like this, where it's pretty smooth and invisible from the front and like this on the inside, and you're done. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you learned something and that this inspires you to be able to alter your clothes so that you wear them more. And If this wasn't for you and you think you'll probably take yours to a tailor, awesome. We love that. Please patron your local tailor. But now that you know what it takes to do this technique, if you ask a tailor to do it, don't question their pricing. And if you have any questions or suggestions for skills that you'd like to learn, please leave them in the comments below. That's it. See you next time.